Hello, everybody, and welcome to the stream for today. I'm going to give it a second to make sure that we're all live. I know people are going to start pouring in as they start to get the live notification. We didn't do our little pre-show music as always, but we do have something kind of special for you today. We're doing the show in a little bit of a different format, something a little bit more unique than just the gameplay. I'm going to turn down my mic gain a little bit because it seems a bit high. I was leveling out a little bit there, so I'm checking my bit rate. Good to go. And yeah, we are live. Cool. So as you can see, I am in a smaller box than I am normally in on this stream today because I am being joined by a man in a much larger box. My friend and colleague here, Steve Gernes. Steve, how you doing today?
Good. How are you doing, man?
I'm good, man. I'm doing great. I'm loving this rain here in Madison, Wisconsin. Beautiful Midwest. Yeah, this is actually the first time. This just occurred to me, but this is the first time that the viewers are getting to see that I actually sit behind this lovely green screen. And some people are commenting on how tiny I am on the screen too. I am tiny, guys. You can fit me in your pocket and bring me around. I don't know if that's a metaphor or what, but that's a possibility. Steve here is the composer for he's the composer for the music in the Lord of the Rings living card game, and I thought it would be kind of fun this Thursday to bring him on and talk to him a little bit about making the music for the game and a little bit about his process. So, Steve, thanks for joining us. Yeah.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, awesome. So I've got Steve here. Yeah, this is my own little Shire Pete. I'm just like a hobbit in my tiny little corner. Yeah. So we're just gonna go over some of the details of making the music. You can hear I've got some music playing in the background here. If you're having trouble hearing it over stream, let me know and I can turn up the levels a little bit. But we wanted to talk a little bit about the soundtrack because I think it's pretty incredible, and I think I wanted to talk to Steve about his process, basically to talk about like developing music. I wanted to talk to you about developing music for Lord of the Rings versus like other fantasy, other games, some other projects. But we have a couple questions for you here today, so we can get started in just a minute.
Great.
I'm gonna turn up the music because I am getting messages that it's a little low here, so I don't want it to like overpower my voice, but I want people to be able to hear something. Okay, cool. So, Steve, you want to introduce yourself first, please?
Yeah, I'm Steve Gernes. I'm a Twin Cities-based composer. I lived in LA for like 5 years and then moved back a couple years ago. And this is the second thing I've done for Fantasy Flight. Battlelore was the first one.
Oh, you worked on Battlelore? Okay, cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you had some other for something else too, but I didn't know it was Battlelore. So you were in LA for a while. What were you doing out there? Some other music stuff, or?
Yeah, I went to USC for their 1-year grad program for film scoring, and then I had like an assistantship for a year, and then a group of my buddies and myself worked on that Netflix show Chef's Table for a couple years.
Okay.
That kind of consumed our lives for quite a bit there. Yeah, and then moved back here. I've been trying to get more into the game music because I find that to be the most fun of all the things to do. Yeah.
Awesome. So you've been composing for a couple of years then, huh?
Yeah, and funny enough, I did a ton of music for Warhammer Fantasy mod that my buddy worked on for Crusader Kings just before this. So.
Oh, no kidding. Okay.
Yeah.
So a little tabletop experience, kind of that crossover still. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. So you're originally from Minnesota as well?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So you play your games yourself? Are you a gamer, or do you just kind of work in the medium?
I do, yeah. I play a bunch of stuff. Like we were talking about before, doing some Overwatch right now.
Uh-huh.
Still playing some Destiny 2. People might get mad at me for that, but I'm still playing some Destiny 2.
I'm into it.
But the big one right now is Baldur's Gate 2, as I'm playing right now. Playing through that again.
Some RPG action, huh?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like the CRPGs as well. So yeah, so you play games as well. So it must be kind of cool to be able to work on something in terms of producing something that you see or hear, I guess in this case, in a game, huh?
Oh, it's really cool. It's super exciting to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So can you talk a little bit about your process? Like what does a day by day look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different kind of composing days. A lot of the boring part of it is, the tech side, templates, workflow. I think I worked on like the template for this project for like a month. It took a long time because big orchestral workflow is really like unique
Yeah, so
thing.
I'm actually not sure what a template would be within composing. How would you explain it to, say, somebody as ignorant as myself?
Oh yeah, like so the digital audio workstation I use, like the master program I use is called Reaper.
Mm-hmm.
And basically you're just trying to make, for orchestral things, you're trying to make whatever, it's a pretty large, 3, 4, or 500 track template, with everything generally mixed how you want it. And
Mm-hmm.
then, each instrument section broken down into ways that you're liking it specifically for that project. And then getting like a big orchestral sound that you like that's unique for that project. And that it involves like slave computers and all that kind of thing, and lots of sample libraries and all that.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Uh,
got to be incredibly difficult to create like an entire orchestral score when you're working alone, right? Like that's essentially what you're doing here, right?
yeah, when it's there's some live stuff on there, but most of this is in the for that big orchestral sound. Most of it's in the box.
Uh-huh.
So you spend a lot of time, listen to a lot of film scores, listen to a lot of classical music, pick some that you want to reference and say, I want to try to get close to that, like that general mixing sound, which is a tricky but really fun thing in itself. Yeah.
So you basically you put together like a sample track of like the mood or the feeling that you want to evoke for this, and then you work from that basically. Is that kind of what you're doing here?
Yeah, for this one, I picked out some orchestral tracks and a few film score ones where I was like, I like the sound. I like the sound that they went for in this orchestra. Like, there's some really good mixes on the first Guardians of the Galaxy soundtrack.
Oh wow.
It's really bitey strings. I like how that everything sits in the mix, so I referenced that. But this one was interesting. I wasn't trying to listen to much fantasy music at all. In particular, I haven't listened to like any of the New Line Cinema music or watched any of those movies in like a year and a half now, since I don't want any of that.
So
I don't want any of that in my head.
That makes sense. So you deliberately stayed away from fantasy stuff in order to kind of create a unique sound for this game. Is that kind of what you're saying here?
As much as I could, yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, I love those movies. I love those soundtracks. So like beginning on this process, I think I did. We do like a getting to know you process because people don't know what they're looking for yet. So you do like 8 or 9 kind of sketch demo tracks in a bunch of different styles to see what resonates with people, see what works for you, see what feels like your Lord of the Rings kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think it was 8, 9, or 10 of those. We did a bunch, but
Wow.
it took a while to get away from that that sound that everybody knows because it's so
Sure.
you know it, I know it, everybody knows it.
Yeah, so it's kind of like forging your own corner of this world, and like I mean, with Tolkien being as big as it is and Lord of the Rings being as big as it is, you kind of have your own room to play around with a sound that isn't necessarily like things you've seen in other places, right?
Yeah, which was really fun.
Yeah.
Like and the more music you get going, the more of like a big base of things you have to draw from. The sound becomes more and more defined, and you get momentum.
That's super cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about the difference between composing for a game or a film? You talked about TV earlier too with the Netflix stuff, versus like for like a game versus a film or a short movie, basically. Like, what kind of challenges do you face when composing for a game specifically instead of something that's more linear and something more guided like a film?
Yeah, that's always like if you're composing to picture, that comes with, directly to picture, that comes with a lot of different challenges. They'll change the picture a lot on you, so you have to be pretty adaptable, and it can be pretty dramatic, maybe 5, 6, 7 times. You'll do a lot of different versions. But the thing about that is you do have the picture to go to. So you do have something guiding you along the way. So your structure is always going to be there, which is good and bad. The fun thing about this one, and this type of game, there's a lot of those background combat tracks for different areas.
Sure.
And you're trying to go, well, okay, I need it to be, part of the balance is like I need it to be driving the pace. I need it to feel right for that specific location or, race you're supposed to represent. And it's like, but it needs to not be too obnoxious. It's going to loop, for 2.5 minutes or something. It needs to not annoy people. But you don't want it to be flat. You don't want it to be flat for 2.5 minutes. You want it to have a decent arc to it. So it's like you try to think through your beginning point as much as possible, get the structure out. And, a tricky bit is like when you're at the 2-minute mark or something, you're going, okay, did I get really big here? Did I have a big build up here? How do I get back
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
point A again? which is a fun challenge. It is a
Yeah.
really fun challenge.
I have to imagine that like designing like menu music has to be really challenging because you want like something that's memorable, right? But you don't want something that's annoying, as people are going to be like, not necessarily annoying, but like it draws attention to itself as you continue to be in this menu, you know, and hear this music over and over again. So like when you're designing menu music, what do you think about primarily for like what is the need? What is the mood you're trying to set when somebody's like browsing a deck builder or something like that?
Yeah, menu. That's funny you bring that up. Menu music is tricky. I had a hard time with two actually the hardest ones. Funny enough, were like the store menu music
Mm-hmm.
and the deck builder music.
Yeah.
Because you want to set a certain vibe, but you can't be, particularly for the deck builder. We went through a couple versions of that. You don't want to be too timid, right? You don't want it to be too ambient, but it can't be too driving and in your face. And actually, it shouldn't have too much of an arc, which can be a tricky thing for composers, right? Because you're always wanting to go like all out and do the craziest thing you've ever done in every track, which is a bad impulse. You have to shove that back down.
I've got the store menu music playing right now, guys. That's what you're hearing in the background here. You can go ahead.
Oh yeah, like those ones, and those are roughly a minute. So, people might spend particularly in the deck builder, people might spend a decent amount of time in there. So you want to set that vibe, but again, like those ones really can't be too big, and they can't be like, you're hoping not to make them obnoxious for people.
For sure. Yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, like, can you talk a little bit about composing specifically for the fantasy genre? Like, how do you begin to build a world? Like, you don't know what this world looks like. It's part of an imagination, but you're trying to build a sound for it and a mood for it. What's that like?
Yeah, and like for like Lord of the Rings, as in particular, it's really difficult because I'm a big Tolkien nerd. I love all the books. I love the movies. I love the Silmarillion. I love going back. I love all that deep cut Tolkien stuff.
Yeah.
So it's like it can be even trickier getting something that's like a dream job, which this one is, because you're like, oh man, I have to do the best thing that's ever been created, ever. And you have all those themes in your head, that kind of thing. It's tricky. Like I said, for like the main theme, which ended up influencing most things, I think that was at least 8 or 9 different really unique tracks we went through. And then what ends up being the main menu track, worked on that for a long time over time, because that's a big track with a big arc. But as far as the really thematic stuff for some of the background combat music, it's like I'd say I probably did half of them handwritten at first to try to get the themes down. Like the Sauron theme for sure.
We just had that playing.
Yeah, that one, and then you try. It can really help for bigger arrangements to handwrite them out and get some arrangement ideas down. And then other ones that are more sound designy are more done in the box, so to speak. But I do find it easier to have for the really big thematic ones when you're wanting more involved orchestration and arrangement to kind of write at least, and I'm not really great at that either, but to write it out by hand and get it out as much as you can. Yeah.
Absolutely. So what if you had to this is kind of a big question, but
Yeah.
if you had to describe the sound of Lord of the Rings in like a sentence, how would you describe that? Like what makes it distinct from specifically other fantasy and maybe even like other properties you worked on, I guess, but I assume it's different than working on a kitchen show for Netflix, but what is Lord of the Rings versus other fantasy, I suppose?
Lord of the Rings is so interesting because the history is like endlessly deep, right? No matter where you scratch just a little bit, you're gonna find, at least I think, you're gonna find like an endless line of really interesting lore, anywhere you look. And at like any point in the Tolkien chronology, it kind of feels that way. So to come up with music for that, I feel like you want to, elves, that kind of thing, you want to get some timelessness across, and you have a lot with elves and dwarves and that kind of thing of, once very mighty civilization, so to speak, that are past their prime,
Mm-hmm.
and the world is moving on from them, that kind of thing.
It's kind of
Sorry, that's tough.
interesting
That's a
that
tough question. I'm kind of rambling.
yeah, no, it's all right. I mean, the interesting thing to me is like the idea of latching onto these societies that are past their prime, and that the theme of like the times moving forward and things changing around them, but they're not necessarily ready for that. Is that something you think speaks to Lord of the Rings, like as a whole? Like, you think
Oh
these?
yeah, big time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the theme that you definitely thought about when you were working on these tracks, then.
Yeah, it's like it's fun to try to get some of that melancholy across.
Mm-hmm.
And also it's been really fun on this as opposed to say like, Warhammer, which is, quite a bit different, but
Mm-hmm.
it's like you can really get that melancholy and this kind of sense, this dark kind of this, mystery and wonder with
Mm-hmm.
it. Um and we did end up doing some more like bombastic heroic tracks, but that's not what like the score skews to for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
It's more on the dark, mysterious side as a whole, I would say.
Do you think you lean that way because it's a card game specifically? So like there's a reason for it to be a little slower in pacing, or is it just because of Lord of the Rings, or is it like a mixture of both?
I think it's a mixture of both. Like we didn't want to have anything too super intense, particularly for the background combat music,
Mm-hmm.
uh, for a lot of the reasons we were talking about before.
Yeah.
And some things do get pretty intense and bombastic, but as a whole, no, not as much. But I think that's how I approach Lord of the Rings as well too. That's my general when reading the books and all that kind of thing. That's the way I generally interpret it. Yeah.
Interesting. So you mentioned earlier, I'm gonna pause this so I can play this other one. You mentioned dwarves and elves basically, and getting those sound right. So this is a track you've created called Dwarvish Hall, and this is one of my favorites within the soundtrack. I'm gonna let it play for a second, and then we can talk about it a little bit. And I want to talk to you about designing for specific races, or composing for specific races, that is.
Yeah.
So the amazing thing about that track for me is that there's a there's like that clanking going on, and that
Yeah.
you know what I mean, and it's like they're at work, but it's not like it's hi ho, it's not like
Yeah.
Snow White dwarves. So like, are you thinking about those industrial sounds when you're designing for this kind of music, or what are you thinking about specifically?
Yeah, dwarves were a tricky one. Interestingly, Warhammer dwarves are really tricky too. That's the thing, I think, because lots of people have really specific ideas in mind when they think of, dwarves or dwarfs when it comes to Warhammer stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, when we were working on that one, when I was working with Tim Garrettson on that, part of his idea was to kind of have these more industrial sounds, obviously not too on the nose, but to try to just get those scrapey, clangy kind of things in there. Because the general vibe we were going for was that more martial, serious. We kind of want to give it a steady pace. And it's funny, yeah. That's like Bode have his old dulcimer. That's like bold dulcimer mixed with some anvil samples and that kind of.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah.
That's super cool. So you use actual like outside sound sources for this, and like not just instruments?
Yeah. I was really, really trying. Took me a little bit to get the sound I was looking for, that scrapey kind of sound. But it ended up being pretty fun with like the low brass kind of, and like the percussion just kind of like driving along at a steady pace. It ended up feeling, I think, pretty dwarvish.
Yeah, it's dwarvesque at least. At the very least. I'm gonna make sure that people can hear our music in the background because I'm getting some notes that it might be a little too quiet. But I'm gonna jump in and I'm gonna play one from Rohan here too, which is another. This is another. There we go. So this is another track that we have. I don't think we've shown it in the game either. but there's kind of more of a brass sound to this than some of the other. So was that a deliberate choice as well?
Yeah, when I was talking with Tim about that, it was, we wanted to get across the sense of cavalry without, again, being too obvious about it. A good way to do that is, we were thinking there's a lot of trumpets in that. This has more trumpets than most of the other tracks. Like a pretty good energy all the way through this one. This one doesn't have a lot of energy lulls. And it feels, particularly with the main theme, it has a bit of a Scandinavian bent to it.
Interesting.
Which just kind of ended up being that way. But I kind of like how it ended up. I think this was the last one I ended up doing. This was the last one I turned in.
Cool. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about like determining characters or races and instruments that you associate with those characters. What about locations? Like, what is the sound of a dark forest to you?
Yeah, dark forest for me is low strings, a lot of low strings, cellos, basses, and then low woodwinds. Bass clarinets, bassoons. I really love low, the low instruments of the orchestral family. And then I think on this one ended up doing like a lot of that juxtaposed with super high violin lines, creepy high, kind of floaty violin lines with these creepy, I have a lot of Rite of Spring influences, that's for sure. So a lot of that kind of thing.
I've got Mirkwood playing right now, which is Mirkwood is something that definitely everybody on the stream is familiar with because we've shown it in this first location. But this is another track that is definitely stuck in my ear, having played the game as much as I have. But yeah, there's kind of a creeping sense to this, and it sets the mood that like you need to go deeper, but you really don't want to. You know what I mean? Within this forest, and I think that's super cool too. We talked a little bit about composing in-game music versus menu music. So just as a general, do you find like creating those loops is more difficult, or do you think making the in-game music, setting that music is more difficult?
I guess it depends on the track. It's some of the background combat tracks are more ambient in nature. Typically the ones that are more location oriented, but the ones that are race specific, like elves, dwarves, Rohan, that kind of thing, they're pretty thematically based. So those take a lot of thought. You want to plan it out, you want to plan out your arc, you want to make sure your theme's not too long and like half half of your track or something, and you're going to get that again in a minute, so you want to kind of pace yourself. Yeah, it really depends on the track. I mean, as I was saying, like some of those menu tracks were really like interestingly tricky, which you go in thinking you're like, oh yeah, just a menu kind of thing, want to do something simple, something unobtrusive, and then that ends up being like the hardest one.
Yeah, I feel that. I mean, it's the same way in game design, right? Where like we come up with something and it ends up being that making the UI intuitive is the most difficult part of designing an adventure. Like getting a hero captured by spiders, we can figure out how to make that work, but making it seem intuitive to click on a card is an entirely different challenge. So we run into the same stuff.
Yeah.
So we recently introduced the threat events, which are these moments where Sauron gets more powerful, and I noticed there's some ambient sound that goes into that too, where like the drums will increase when Sauron gets more threat, and there's some other things like that. Are you designing the musical stingers too? Are you composing those as well?
Yeah, I did all the stingers too. So I know we have those threat ones, we have hero death ones, we have hero death stingers. As far as the in-game ones go, there's like a travel stinger on the map. And then I think there's a Palantir stinger too, if I'm going to recall correctly.
Yeah, absolutely, in the Palantir, yep.
But doing those stingers as well, which, typically for the combat stuff, they're more percussion based because they can happen anytime. So they can't be too tonal. Yeah. So perk works great for that.
But that's creating a mood itself too, right? Like that's a little bit more player based though, instead of being part of like a scene or something thematically within the story. That's something that's happening to the player itself. So you kind of make music that's more interactive by designing these stingers, or what's the process look like for that?
Yeah, so you like those happened after the tracks were done. So what I find to be useful is to put the track in something like Fmod or
Mm-hmm.
Wise or something, and make 3 or 4 or 5 different versions of the stingers, and trigger them on the fly in there as you go, and say, oh, does that seem like it's working? And sometimes no, but that kind of interactive, you know, semi-random way of doing it has been a pretty good way of testing things out.
Interesting. So you mentioned that there's a lot of back and forth between you and the other developers on the game. What does that process look like? Do you normally get like a set of mood, or do you get like a description? Is it like an art brief, but for music? Like what kind of documentation do you get before you start composing, and then what's the back and forth kind of like?
Yeah, so like when we first started, it's just like we had some, which makes sense. We had some general like music from the movies as reference tracks.
Mm-hmm.
Not like to be used thematically or anything, but just like the general mood you're thinking of for, say, the main menu or something like that. And then like once the kind of main menu theme got going, and there's lots of different themes in there on like a track to track basis. Sometimes they'll just be like, yeah, just try, this is the general mood we're going for, just try something out. And then if one turns out to be a bit trickier, or we're having a harder time getting on the same page, which is a completely normal part of the process.
Right.
I'll say, did you have any like reference tracks or anything from movies or games that, not that you want it to sound exactly like this, but does this kind of capture the feel you're looking for? Which, that tends to help a lot. I got some good reference tracks from Tim, and sometimes with sometimes with the process, because the Dwarvish Hall one is the second version of that. We tossed a whole first version, which was just fine, because it's like sometimes that's the best way to get on the same page as somebody, is just to do something. You figure out, in general, is that working or not? And even if you toss the whole thing, it's been time well spent.
It's part of the process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So it is a lot of back and forth, it sounds like, but you're not really getting specific documentation as much as you're getting like notes and references and things like that, huh?
Yeah, and sometimes we'll exchange ideas about like structure, loop structure, that kind of thing. But in general, I had lots of freedom on this one. It was a really satisfying collaboration. Yeah.
Kind of nice to be able to spread out a little bit and be creative, huh?
Yeah. It's Lord of the Rings, man. It's great.
Yeah. Do you so you've been keeping up a little bit with the streams. I don't want to grill you or anything, but do you have a favorite Lord of the Rings character? Anybody that you maybe have seen in the game or would like to see in the game at some point?
Favorite Lord of the Rings character? That's tough to pick, but I love Tom Bombadil.
Me too, man. Me too. I'm a big Tom Bombadil fan.
Some people don't, but I do.
Exactly.
I think I remember reading somewhere that Tom Bombadil will appear in here on some forums there and stuff.
Yeah, we've had him on stream a couple of times now.
Sweet.
He's popped up and done some work, which is great. I mean, even a character like that, like having his own unique mood, just kind of speaks to how big Lord of the Rings is and how many different things are there. Like he is such an enigma, especially compared with the rest of the mood of the game. So you haven't composed for a card game before, but you composed for Battlelore, you mentioned, which is another Fantasy Flight.
Yeah.
Yep, that's another Fantasy Flight, and published by Asmodee Digital, just like us. So can you talk a little bit about like, did you think about card games any differently than you did something like Battlelore or some of the other stuff that you've composed for, or was it just like, well, it doesn't really matter, I'm thinking more about Lord of the Rings?
No, it's definitely different for a card game. It takes a while to get into the right mindset, for the menus, but for the bulk of the music, which is the background combat music, so much of it is about pacing, right? For the most part, it's tricky and fun challenge, because for the most part, you want to keep the pace up, because you don't want that vacuum of energy, that kind of thing. But you're also trying to keep in mind all the background combat tracks as a whole, and how players will be experiencing it, and saying, well, they don't all have to have this level of energy. Some can be more ambient. And you want to change up the pace. Absolutely. On like a meta level like that too, which is another fun aspect to keep in mind. but it's a definitely different mindset doing something for a card game. It was fun adapting to that.
Yeah, it's kind of weird because the creators like don't have any control of the pace. Like the player, the consumer, has control over like the pace and what the mood basically is going to be. So do you have to be like more malleable when you're designing for a card game, or do you find that it's very similar in terms of that player control when you're composing for other games as well?
No, I think you have to be a bit more malleable. As you say, you don't know, is somebody just gonna like sit here for a bit and really think things through for a long time, or like on a menu, is somebody going to sit on this menu for a really long time, or just like have it in the background? Like you want to keep it interesting, but you don't want to be annoying.
Well, as someone who has spent time both professionally and personally listening to the soundtrack, not only when I work but when I'm here working on the game or even working on documents or whatever at my desk, it has definitely been good mood music, and I'm glad to have it available outside of just the outside of the game itself.
Thanks, man. Yeah, I'm really satisfied with everything that came out of it. It was great, really great to work on.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask, because I don't know if we have anybody watching, or if we will in the future have people who are watching this who specifically want to get into game composing, but do you have any words of advice about that? Anything for somebody who would want to do that?
Yeah, not uniquely weird as far as I think creative work goes, but it's a weird competitive field. When you go to school, that kind of thing. I went to a normal liberal arts college, and I only like switched to a music major in like the last year or something. I didn't want to write a bunch of papers. There you go. It was more fun to do music. And then I went, to an extremely specific grad school for a year, and it's a tricky thing. A big part of the mantra they give you is like, say yes to everything, and like be everything to everybody. Yeah, but some of the best advice I got is just if you're faking it and trying to do something really don't like doing, or trying to be a way you really don't like do it, there's going to be a bunch of other people, because there's lots of composers that really like doing things that way, and they're going to be better at doing that thing than you because they like doing it. So there's no reason not to like put up a beacon for what you're all about and really try to do your own thing as much as possible.
Kind of forge your own path.
Yeah, well, because there's so many composers, and it's like if you're really doing something, if you're just trying to sound like the the flavor of the month kind of thing all the time, you don't like doing it. A lot of people love doing it.
Yeah,
that's their thing. They'll probably do it better than you, so you might as well try to do your own thing, I think.
It's very inspiring. Be true to your own self. I like that. That's pretty great. Can you mention any? I wanted to give you a little bit of time if there's anything you have. Is there like any gear or equipment that you want to nerd out about or recommend? I know that as a person who like works kind of in production, there are like certain things that I completely swear by in terms of equipment. Is there anything that a composer like would need that I could go out and get today if I wanted to start?
Well, it's like we were talking about computer rigs earlier. Like for this one took I have 2 PC slaves and then a Mac tower for this one. And Vienna Ensemble Pro is the network and hosting software. MIDI talks over Ethernet and audio, so it sends back and forth. Really great. It's really reliable. That's something. Like I was saying before, I use Reaper. Reaper's my DAW, which, yeah, Reaper. I love Reaper. They're a great little company, and you can get it for, well, you can use it for free, but you should pay them the $60. It's dirt cheap, and it's like endlessly customizable. I'm a big synth guy. I didn't use any hardware synths. I got them over here in the room. I didn't use any hardware synths on Lord of the Rings. I don't think I could have found any spots for it. But I'm a big Moog guy and DSI guy. Let me think. I just got super hooked on the Softtube Console 1.
Yeah.
Their controller. It's like endless gear. It never stops. Gear never stops.
I know how that is too, yeah. Chad, if you have any questions too, go ahead and drop them, and Steve can help you out. He's the composer for the game, so if there's anything about like mood, atmosphere, or anything like that that you'd like to ask him, go ahead and drop those questions, and I can party him on over to him. Do you collaborate, like, is the back and forth the same for games as it is for film? Like, do you collaborate in the same way, or is that, since it's more of a set product, do you like kind of know what you are getting into it? You kind of mentioned that they'll change scenes on you quite frequently, but do you find it the same kind of back and forth, or
it can be really similar depending on who you're working on. You know, if you have similar personality types, and it kind of depends, like you know, it kind of depends like how much somebody is willing to trust you with like their baby, kind of, so to speak, because usually it is for people. And sometimes people are, which is understandable, are really not, so they want to have a lot of control over the process, which is fine, you know, but it can be trickier doing that because it could take a lot of versions to get there. Or, you know, sometimes you work on something when they have something extraordinarily specific in mind, and they'll have temp music, and they're like, this is what we want. Just do it like that. But usually you try to resist and try to change it up as much as you can. That's part of the fun. But it really depends on who you're working with. Yeah.
Interesting. Cool.
Yeah.
So do you have a favorite track on this soundtrack? I'm sure you've listened to it plenty yourself, being the person who makes it. Is there something that like stands out to you, or something you're particularly proud of?
Let me think. I have different favorites this time, like based on like when I, you know, because usually when you work a long time on one thing, you kind of don't listen to it again for a while, and then you come back to it. But I'm still really fond of how the main menu theme turned out.
Really?
That went through a ton of iterations. And I think it ended up in a pretty cool place. And I think it was fun to have like this, you know, be able to get some like dark sense of wonder and mystery in there, which ended up influencing some of that stuff. Turned into like the narration music that plays before a mission, and then that ended up influencing like the Elvish stuff for sure.
Yeah, we've heard this main menu theme before, folks, but I've got it playing now if you were wondering which track Steve was talking about. So we've got a question here from Tuor, asks, how do you guys learn about LOTOR lore? Just from personal background, or is there some kind of formal Lord of the Rings boot camp when you're added to the project? So how could you speak a little bit to your background with Lord of the Rings? Do you remember the first time like you encountered it, or anything like that? Any interesting stories about it?
I mean, it's like when I was a little kid, like my dad would read my sister and I The Hobbit. And that's kind of how it started. And then, you know, I think when I was in junior high, I read the trilogy for the first time, and then a couple more times after that, and then like I started to really geek out over it, and like I read the Silmarillion a bunch of times, and like tried to convince a bunch of my friends that it's actually really interesting, and they still didn't believe me, because the first couple chapters are kind of slow, right? It's like the mythos and all that, but I don't know. Read a ton of Tolkien. Seen those movies a lot of times.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was pretty similar, where like I picked up The Hobbit when I was really, really young and read that. And then I kind of remember picking up Return of the King for the first time because it was in like a free library, like a teacher's like library, and I remember reading that first and like voraciously finishing it in like the course of like 4 days, I think, something like that, something like ludicrous, and then going back to it the same way. So I think for all of us, it's basically a personal background. I'm sure everyone at the studio has their own story like that, but it sounds pretty similar to the way that you encountered it too, Steve. It's just it's kind of around you, and then it becomes a part of your life, basically, right?
Yeah, big time. Yeah.
Pete here. Hey, Pete. Pete's asking, Steve, have you worked with any orchestras for soundtracks? Would you like to, or do you feel that sample libraries are kind of all that you need?
Oh, loaded question. Good question.
I'm getting a
you know, when I was in school, we worked. I mean, that's where most of the tuition goes to. We got to work with a lot of bigger orchestras for about a year, which is really fun. I mean, there's a ton of work. There's a ton of extra work that goes into that. You know, you have to make sure your arrangement is really perfect. You have to get all the notation done. You have to print and tape all the parts. You know, you have to go to the studio and have all the musicians there, and it's there's a lot that goes into that. On Chef's Table, we did a lot of smaller, maybe 4 to 10, uh, you know, people per ensemble, mostly strings.
Mm-hmm.
It depends. Like, samples are getting really, really great. And if you're a big nerd about it and you obsess about it, you can get the digital orchestra to sound really good.
Yeah.
But I still think nothing. You know, if I had the choice, you know, like it's incredibly expensive.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, musicians are really good. Real orchestra sounds can't really replace it.
Interesting.
And you know, but what happens most these days, I would say, is hybrid of the two.
Mm-hmm.
So a big thing that happens is to take a smaller ensemble and layer it on top of your digital mock-up, and that little bit of organic playing tends to draw the ear and can really fool you into thinking, oh yeah, it's real orchestra, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
For virtuosic solos and that kind of thing, for sure, real players. But I try to like to get real players as much as possible.
Interesting.
But then again, I geek out endlessly over orchestral mock-ups, so I love that too.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, that's all I've got. I'm gonna let chat come up with a couple of other things while we just right before we go. We'll have a last call for questions, and then I can let you go because it's 1:40 here. I don't know if you have anything else planned for the day, what your daily schedule kind of looks like. But thanks for taking the time out.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's a ton of fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
Trying to get back into playing bass, stand-up bass and cello again, so I'm trying to get my chops back.
Oh, you're learning that, or have you played before?
Yeah, I've played bass. I'm learning kind of self-teaching cello, but I got to get those muscles back.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the last thing that I would like to ask, and again, this is a big one. We kind of asked something similar earlier, but like for you, Lord of the Rings, what does it mean? Like one sentence, one word, however you want to do it. Like, what is the most important takeaway from those books for you?
One takeaway. It's just like the most believable, deep, and like endlessly rich fantasy universe. Put a period on that. There we go.
Ship it off. That's perfect.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of other fantasy I like, but you know, it's like the Tolkien universe is something else.
So I'm curious about believable. You use that word, and like obviously, you know, orcs and elves, but there is something about the world that feels more organic and grounded than other fantasy. Would you agree with that, or?
Yeah, it's like you dig and you can look back to how things began, you know, and how things evolve in the world, and you go, you know, yeah, it's you know, a fantastical world as a whole. But as far as fantastical worlds go, yeah, I think it has a very organic, natural, evolving nature to it.
The amazing thing to me, like whenever you have anything where a lot of other things have derived from that, especially like Lord of the Rings and other fantasy, is that you return to the source material. And a lot of the things that people have extrapolated from it, you know, like wizards shooting bolts of lightning out of their hands, or like, you know, slaying like fire-breathing dragons, like these things aren't really as much present in this, even though it is the tome from like all these things came from. It's like so much more grounded, and like believable does feel like the correct word, even though it's still fantasy to me.
Yeah, you know, it's like the wizards in Lord of the Rings have mysterious origins for the most part, and like they don't have very obvious like book of spells, right, that kind of thing. You know, yeah. It seems more organic in that way. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks again for joining me, Steve.
Hey, thanks for having me. Yeah, glad we got all the technical stuff worked out.
Yeah, perfect. we had a bit of a we had a bit of an episode trying to get everything set up earlier today, folks, before stream. So, do you have a site you'd like to plug? Any kind of upcoming work or anything else that you'd like to plug on stream for viewers?
Yeah, I mean, my website is stevengernes.com. I have SoundCloud if you guys want to check it out. I have my all the Warhammer stuff I did recently up there for Warhammer Fantasy. I think I have if you look up on YouTube, CK2, it's a long one. CK2 Warhammer Geheimnis Nacht OST. It's on there as a playlist.
Awesome.
If you're into some Warhammer music, yeah.
Cool. And that's about it that we have for you today, folks. Other housekeeping, we are still hiring. We are hiring a technical designer. You can find that on Asmodee Careers. You can also find that. We'll send out the link on Twitter. We'll also send a link out to your website on Twitter, Steve, so people can find you. Are you on Twitter? Are you on social?
I'm not. I'm not.
Lucky you. That's all right. We'll send out a link to that too, and we'll let people know, and we'll plug it in the YouTube description too. Yeah, thanks for joining us today, folks. I know this is kind of a different format, something else we're experimenting. We're going to talk to more people on the team about developing the game, and Steve was just the first of many guests. Hopefully they'll be able to join us for that, to talk about the music here. So like I said, we're hiring a technical designer. You can find us online at twitter.com at FFI_games. You can find us at Facebook.com/FFI games. You can find us on Twitch.tv right here at FFI games, and you can find us on YouTube.com/FantasyFlight Interactive, where we have all of these archive streams. We have some trailers, some other stuff upcoming. We have a lot of stuff coming up in the works that I've been hard at work producing these past couple weeks here. But that stuff should start to drop. As always, please wishlist the game. It's the best way to let our publishers and developers know that you are waiting for the game, that you are there regionally, that we have an audience that are looking for this game to come out and waiting for it to go into early access here in Q1 2018. And any other information will drop from you guys more. I see people in the chat are already asking for more guests and stuff like this, and this is definitely something we're interested in doing in the future too, and maybe change the format a little bit so I'm not so tiny. But yeah, again, thank you again for joining us, guys. And then last thing I wanted to mention, some people in the chat were talking about purchasing the soundtrack or getting it as a standalone. That's not something we're ready to talk about yet, but we do have something kind of interesting planned with that in the future. So consider this my hint dropped and my tease for what we're going to have for information about that in the future. So once again, Steve, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
And we're going to jump off here, guys. Have a good one. Thanks. Bye.